Joining us now, Walter Dellinger, who served as Assistant Attorney General and head of the Office of Legal Counsel from 1993 to 1996. He was acting Solicitor General from 1996 to 1997. Also with us, John Heilemann, National Affairs Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. And joining us, David Frum, Senior Editor at The Atlantic. Walter Dellinger, take us through the possibilities here. And one of the things I want to consider as we approach this is Jeff Sessions may already be a subject of the special prosecutor's investigation, possibly for perjury in testifying to the Senate, or possibly for involving his possible Russian connections. Is it possible that Jeff Sessions tonight has to worry that if he participates in the firing of the special prosecutor, that could add a possible obstruction of justice risk to him in what could become any investigation that follows that?
Well, as you know, Attorney General Sessions recused himself from anything having to do with the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. For him to unrecuse himself and to participate in any decision to dismiss the special counsel, I think would place him in extraordinary personal legal jeopardy. So I cannot imagine, no matter how loyal he may be to Donald Trump, that he would be the one to step into that at his own personal legal peril. It's much more likely that in the unthinkable world in which we were to dismiss the special counsel, that the president would direct the Deputy Attorney General, Ron Rosenstein, to do that. I knew Rosenstein a bit. Most people who've been in Washington, Justice Department, law enforcement know him. I find it unthinkable that he would accept and carry out such an order. So I believe that he would resign and that the president would have to go down the list. One of the problems is there are not many confirmed officials in the Department of Justice who are in the hierarchy to become acting Deputy Attorney General and to take on that authority. I don't know how many people would have to resign before President Trump would find someone who would carry out the order to discharge Mr. Mueller. You have to remember the extraordinary confidence that Robert Mueller has among federal judges all across the country, among FBI agents all across the country, among Republicans and Democrats who've been in law enforcement or justice or law firms, who is a Republican who served for 2 terms under President Bush as director of the FBI. I mean, this would be such an extraordinarily shocking event that it would not simply call into question the integrity of this investigation. It would call into question whether we really were operating under the rule of law at all.
Let's listen to Newt Gingrich making the case for firing the special prosecutor.
I think that what Republicans ought to focus on is closing down the independent counsel, because he's not independent. He apparently is very close to Comey. We know Comey hates Trump. You have to assume that that has to leak over to Mueller. And you have to assume that the people Mueller's going to bring in are essentially Justice Department people who were 33-1 in favor of Clinton over Trump.
David Frum, your reaction to Newt Gingrich?
First, he was calling him an independent counsel, and that's an important mistake. The independent counsel law was allowed to lapse at the end of the last century because there are doubts about its constitutionality. The special counsel is under the president because people have argued that the president can be trusted to investigate himself. The executive branch can have its own safeguards. If that turns out not to be true, then you are into political remedies of the most dire kind. And maybe Newt Gingrich would welcome that because it's kind of an apocalyptic scenario and he enjoys those. But, you know, I don't want to sound like I have the limited imagination you condemn, but if President Trump really does fire Robert Mueller, he might as well just hire a skywriter to trace and smoke over the White House, "I am super guilty."
John Heilemann, with Newt Gingrich seems to be laying out the kind of talking points that if this goes forward, I would expect to hear from more Republicans.
Right. I mean, look, there's one version of kind of conventional political analysis, Lawrence, that says that, look, this is never going to happen, that Newt Gingrich and the other assorted Trump allies out there are effectively, I say this on the night of another game in the NBA Finals, working the refs and are trying to muddy up Robert Mueller, are trying to launch a campaign against him to damage his credibility going forward, and importantly, to gin up some of the flagging enthusiasm of the Trump base that we've been reading about in polling analysis over the course of the last few days, that the White House is very concerned about the notion that they understand that he's never going to be a 50.1% president, that they need to keep his base whipped up, they need to keep it solid, and that these kind of talking points are part of the way to do that. I think that conventional political analysis is probably right as far as it goes, but like you, I don't think it's at all unthinkable. I don't think the supposedly unthinkable is at all unthinkable, given what we have seen so far over the course of this administration. And it does feel to me tonight, I'm not predicting this is going to happen. It could end up being that the conventional political analysis is right. It's also possible that we're standing right now at the brink of a constitutional crisis.
David, let's go back to the Nixon model. Let's remember the most important thing about the Nixon case. The president was guilty, and he knew that when he fired the special prosecutor. And so a lot of the analysis of President Trump is of a politician who is trying to preserve his political future. What if what we have here is someone who is guilty, who knows he's guilty? Firing the special prosecutor has a logic to it.
Right. Well, it is like a confession. But here's a difference. With President Nixon in 1973, he faced a Congress that was politically and ideologically sympathetic to him because conservative Democrats or more conservative Democrats had the upper hand, but it was a Congress in the hands of the other party in both houses. He couldn't count on their total complacence. Donald Trump may be gambling that he can, or to follow what John said, at least if he revs up the core Republican base enough in these safe Republican districts. Because the great calculation that Republicans are all making is, as they look with increasing dismay at Donald Trump, are they safer if they run away from him, or are they safer if they cling to him?
And Walter Dellinger, play out this drama for us a bit. If this does happen, and let's say we see something like what we saw in the Saturday Night Massacre with the Attorney General not either quitting or not being involved in it at all through his recusal, Rod Rosenstein possibly resigning, as you predict he might do. The next person in line, isn't that the old job you had, Solicitor General?
It is, Lawrence, but the question is the Solicitor General is not confirmed at this moment, and so is not eligible to become acting Attorney General. Neither is the next ranking person in the department. The head of OLC is not yet confirmed. So we're sort of entering into a black hole to try to find someone who would carry out this truly unthinkable deed.
And so, John Heilman, that would leave the administration, leave the White House basically calling over there, having to wire this whole thing ahead of time. They can't stand to go through the surprise that Nixon got of discovering what Elliot Richardson was going to do only when the moment came.
Right. Well, this is, again, I think, Lawrence, this is the scenario where I do think we get quickly, for the reasons that Walter just laid out, you could very quickly find yourself in a constitutional crisis. And I do think, to tie up with one of the things David said, that this calculation for Republicans who have always held the fate of Trump in their hands, not Democrats, but Republicans, at what point is it more expensive to carry Trump as opposed to, and stick with him as opposed to run away from him? There is going to be a point where it's more expensive to stick with him. And in the kind of black hole constitutional crisis, the notion that the White House is effectively taking over the Justice Department and the old standard walls that divided the two and gave some independence, measure of independence to the Justice Department, have come crumbling down entirely. That is where it becomes unthinkable for me to imagine, or becomes unthinkable, that Republicans eventually don't look at that and say, enough, this is going to destroy us in 2018. We must put a stop to this. I don't know exactly where that point is, but that point begins to become maybe, just maybe, foreseeable.
David Frum, a quick last word before we go to a break.
Look, but you are hearing, and this is the most ominous thing, voices in the conservative world saying the president has the right not only to appoint an FBI director, but to fire him, and to fire him for any reason. That is a new vision of the FBI director. Maybe we're going to hear a new vision of the special counsel, too.
David Frum, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Hey there. there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.